Before talking about the angled motor mounts, I'm going to talk about these two guys real quick again, because the video I put out last week was very obviously misinterpreted because I clearly did not say things the way I intended to say them. I shoot these videos really quickly. I didn't really have much time last week, and that was a totally unfiltered me. I was just kind of blurting out whatever was on my mind. And I totally forgot to say that these two both fly amazing. They're both very, very fun to fly. Very, very fun to fly. And I really do recommend things of this size, whoop size things that are brushless, because they are super fun to fly. That being said, I still don't recommend the Mobula-7 because it is just an aggregation of random parts that were just thrown together that are not really capable of holding up to the power and punishment of 2S. And the biggest reason why I'm telling you this is because somebody in the comments, which I can't find, I'll put it on the screen if I find him, he told me something that totally changed my perception of all these things. I should not have been comparing the Mobula-7 to the Tiny Hawk. I should have been comparing the Mobula-7 to the Baby Hawk R, because it is much closer to a Baby Hawk R than it is a Tiny Hawk. And that also makes a lot more sense now when you think about the construction and the structure of the thing. The Baby Hawk R is very durable, but it's not indestructible. It is definitely much more durable than the Mobula-7. The Mobula-7 is just not durable. But also, I still don't recommend the Mobula-7. While that comparison does put it more into perspective and it does make it more reasonable, I still don't recommend the Mobula-7 because I know that there are a number of other products that are on the way that are absolutely 100% better. The first one being the Eachine Trash Can. Yeah, it's actually called Trash Can, and Sergio and I had a good laugh on that, and I think that they were taking a page out of Sergio's playbook of having a Who Cares brand. Anyways, the Trash Can has an F4 processor, has a much upgraded frame, it's got better motors, it's got an upgraded camera, it's just completely upgraded, and it costs the same money. So why would you bother getting the Mobula-7? Now, I still recommend the Tiny Hawk because it has been built to be quality, and it has held up incredibly well for me in terms of durability. Yes, you see that I have kind of jimmied the frame together. I've also crammed a different camera in there because I just didn't like the camera quality. And it still flies great with this random piercing paperclip thing that I made. Anyways, just wanted to say that. They both fly great. It's also not stupid to fly whoops outside. It's just stupid to fly whoops in a wide open environment that's empty. Basically like flying a mini quad in space. Why would you want to fly a mini quad in space? Okay, let's move on to the angled motor mounts. So let's first go over a little bit of the history of angled motor mounts. And what I'm trying to do with these mounts is different than what people have traditionally tried to do. So the first time I was aware of angled motor mounts was when the blackout days, like the blackout mini quad days, the blackout 220, I don't even remember the name, gosh, it's been so long. Anyways, so back then, people were using FPV cameras that were board cameras. They weren't like the nice FPV cameras that we have now. They were a physical circuit board that was kind of large, like 25 by 25, more than 25, I think it's like 30 by 30 even. Anyways, it was just a circuit board with the sensor on it and a lens just like glued onto the circuit board. And so the frames that we had access to, they didn't provide enough tilt on the, like, people weren't very good at flying. And we were getting a lot better, and the code was just rubbish. But people were still becoming somewhat adept at flying, and they realized that they needed more tilt on the lens to be able to go forward, or else they're just looking at the ground when they're flying. So when motor mounts first arose, or when I personally first took notice of them, was when people were putting angled motor mounts to point the motors forward so that it give you a simulation of having more camera tilt. And so people were putting like 10 degrees, 15 degrees, I think even 20 degree motor mounts that were tilted forward to try and get that tilt angle. And that did work back then because we didn't have any other options. But today, I would personally say that that was a really awful idea, because when you tilt the motors, you're pretty much blowing the thrust from the front disc directly onto the rear disc. And we know today that that's a really big issue for handling and control, and PID and control and prop wash, all that stuff is all impacted by the dirty air that the props get, either from each other or from other environmental sources, like flying over fire. It's a very turbulent, dynamic situation. Anyways, also in our journey to improve our ability to fly these things, people started doing crazy things with angled motor mounts to try and get the quads to fly the way they wanted. So what some of the guys from Aerial GP started doing was they started running the angled motor mounts But then they started running 6-inch props in the rear, 5-inch props in the front, and double angle in the rear to kind of push them forward when they slammed the throttle. And so I mean, back then I even thought all they were doing was just overloading the flight controller that didn't really have the ability to compensate. It was an ACE-32. The code was clean flight. Like, it was just not nearly as good as it is right now. And I think they were just overloading the flight controller, so when they hit the gas, the rear of the quad would just lift up and automatically tilt forward because we just weren't good enough to get that tilt down accurately when we're flying. So it was really interesting to see that. I thought it was really cool back then as well. Sometime after that, I actually went to the World Drone Prix in Dubai, and I didn't know this at the time, but Andy from GetFPV told me that Johnny Scher was actually running a mini quad with dihedral on it for that race, and it's the Chaos X. It's still for sale now. It still has dihedral, and it was a thought back then that it would be more stable in the air. Aerial photography platforms have had dihedral on their motor mounts forever, pretty much, and that there is a lot of science behind that. A lot of people have written research papers on it that it is more stable. It should be more stable in there. I don't know. I haven't really compared aerial photography platforms. I have a Phantom. It flies around great. I've flown a lot of DJI stuff. They all fly fantastic. But apparently it helps. So at some point after World Drone Prix, I think it was after, a company came up with a neat idea to actually make motors that twist instead of the quad pitching forward. So now you could have your camera just pointing forward, and your motors would physically twist, and it would go forward. And today I would say that is probably an absolutely awful idea. Back then, nobody knew better. We didn't know better, so I'm not banging on that company at all. But it was really cool. It looked really awesome. But now we know that blowing turbulent air directly onto a prop that's supposed to be doing work for you is probably not a good idea. So yeah, I never flew one of those things. I still would like to fly one of those things because they are so cool looking. But anyways, yeah, there was that. So I'm sure there was a couple other use cases for angled motor mounts, but let's talk about how I'm trying to use them today here. So there's the guy that runs the blog Shrediquette, and he noticed an effect a long time ago that I recently re-noticed again, which is when you're trying to fly through gates, particularly in racing, you kind of drift through the gate sideways if it's in the middle of a turn, and that's because you're physically trying to make the turn and you can't, so you have to go through the gate kind of sideways. And that's really annoying because you're looking out your camera out of the corner of your camera, and you need a much wider field of view on your camera. That's why one of the reasons why in racing a wide field of view is very helpful, but it also makes it more difficult when the gate looks like it's a mile away and you're trying to hit a little hole that's the size of like a grain of rice from like 100 feet away. It just looks like it's a mile away. Anyways, so this effect is very annoying, and this is what I'm trying to target. I'm trying to see if it can be improved with this method. So the guy that writes Shrediquette blog, his method was to create an airfoil that's placed underneath the props, and it's an airfoil. It's not like a rudder. It's not supposed to be a rudder. It's an airfoil that will generate like pressure on the side. So side force generators. That's why he called it side force generators. There are many frame designers that have recognized this drifting problem, and they've dealt with it various other ways. And early on, a lot of racers recognized that 6-inch quads that are bigger, just a general bigger frame, fly much better, much more locked in, as we like to say, than 5-inch quads, especially in a race setting. So then we kind of slowly started to realize that it might be because of the front to back distance of the props and not so much the side to side distance. So the concept that the rear props are getting cleaner air than they would be if the two front and back props were closer together might be what is causing this to fly better. So that's why we came up with the Shrediquette design, and that's kind of taken a life of its own. But there are other ways to go about this. There is the Z-frame design, which the rear props are just raised above the front props, and that does give you a similar effect as the Shrediquette. But like the Shrediquette, the Z-frame, or the step frame, it causes a couple of little annoyances with the control handling and the feel of the quad in the air. The Stretch X does as well, and many people don't like it because it does kind of alter the way the quad flies a little bit. We all agree that it is very nice to have that really amazing grip, but it's kind of wonky. So it does help a little bit with the drifting, but it doesn't totally solve the problem. Many of the Korean pilots have started running frames that have a wider stance in the back than the front. At least I think it started in Korea. So they're running an X frame where the front has kind of like 5-inch arms and the rear has 6-inch arms. I don't know if they're actually 6-inch, but they're just a wider stance. I'm assuming this is to help with that same grip issue or drift issue, and I haven't tried it yet myself. I'm going to be trying it myself, and there's a couple of pilots on the Paraflip team that are going to be testing frames that have this wider rear because the Koreans like it so much. They really swear by it at this point. It's going to be interesting to see how that works. The guys in Sweden, I think they're from Sweden guys, they have created a box frame. So they love the box frame style, and they've been talking to me about it for years now, like 2 years now. And I have been trying to design one to my liking, but it's just a really complicated design. I personally have too much OCD to deal with that many parts. It is a fantastic design, and I do think it has a lot of merit, and it has really could have amazing performance, but it's just a little complicated for me to actually get a design that I like, although I'm getting kind of close to it. But they say that this design, it definitely tracks much better in the air, both up and down as well as side to side. And that does also make sense because the box structure is sort of acting like a wing, like it's actually tracking the quad. But like I said, I don't think quads are moving sideways fast enough for just a fin like the box frame fin to generate enough pressure to track the quad straight. Maybe a slightly little bit, but it's not going to be something a human can really probably tell. I personally think both the side force generators that Shrediquette was testing, as well as the box structure frames, I think those frames do better about kind of rectifying the twisted airflow coming off the prop disc, which I talked to a couple of aerodynamics guys, and they say the thrust coming off the disc is not actually that, it's not that twisted. It's actually mostly straight. But even so, I would say, just my intuition, this is just me, my opinion, my intuition tells me that I don't see the quads moving sideways fast enough to generate enough force to make fins meaningful, and I think it might be that these structures beneath the props are kind of just straightening out the flow, and it's giving the flight controller an easier time to deal with the thrust. So I have now come forward and I've been trying to figure out a way to kind of solve this sideways drifting problem, and I just came up with this idea that maybe if I had dihedral or just angled props on just the roll dimension, not the front and back dimension, that may help with the drifting. And my concept was that as the quad is kind of going sideways, you have, if you think about the angle, these are 16-degree angled motors, so it's like 32-degree angles total. You may get one side that is kind of pushing you a little bit forward, while the other side is kind of pushing you a little bit into the turn. Kind of hard to conceptualize. I personally thought that might happen, or the angle would just cancel each other out and it would just fly like crap and it would just be less power overall. So I flew it a couple times on a couple different props, and I have two videos. I forgot to hit record on one of the flights, so I have two videos to show you. It seems to do absolutely nothing. And FPP Provo actually commented on the picture I put up on Instagram saying that he tested it a while back and it just felt like the quad had about 20% less power. Yeah, that's pretty much exactly what it felt like to me. The quad just has about 25-30% less power. But, and a slight little but, it sort of feels like it's doing something, but I can't really put my finger on what that something actually is. You might be able to tell from the video. It's really hard to tell from the video what's going on. Just looking at flight videos, it's hard to tell anything. But you might be able to tell from the video that rolls are a little bit smoother looking. I can tell you that they definitely felt softer. Rolls definitely felt a lot softer. And it was generally easier to fly the quad smoothly, like really smoothly, especially in like yaw and roll kind of conditions, like swooping around objects. It was really fluid and really easy. I'm assuming that's because I just had less thrust overall to do things. Yaw was completely unaffected, and the pitch also felt completely unaffected, so that's nice. but roll did seem to feel just a hair smoother. Now the quad did have a lot less power, and the thrust and general throttle response was a lot more unpredictable. It was actually really difficult to fly really low to the ground or kind of make it through objects or things. It was really easy to fly in a wide open environment, but it was really hard to get accurate kind of flying around branches like I usually like to do. So that's one thing to say. I can't really tell why that is. I generally wouldn't recommend it. I wouldn't recommend it at all. It's not really worth, I don't think it's worth investigating any further. The prop wash that you see in the video, or you're hearing in the props flutter, are probably not from the angled motor mounts. They're probably more from the motor mounts wiggling, because they are made of TPU and they do wiggle quite a bit. So yeah, you could kind of put that concept to rest. And I like I've said in the past, I don't think angled motor mounts make sense in racing quads or mini quads the way we fly them, because it's just causing inefficiencies, and it definitely caused a lot of inefficiencies in this quad that I was testing. So yeah, if there's some aerodynamics guys or some flight guys out there, please chime in the comments below. If I find some interesting comments things, we'll definitely discuss it in the next video, bring it up. But I've pretty much put this down. Okay, hope that was informational. Don't forget to floss your teeth. Bye.